Good morning, brothers and sisters. Let us pray. Almighty and everlasting God, who's given us unto thy great servant's grace by the confession of a true faith to acknowledge the glory of the eternal Trinity and empower the divine majesty to worship the unity. We beseech thee that thou wouldest keep us steadfast in this faith and evermore defend us from all adversities, who livest and reignest one God, world without end. Amen. We turn our attention to hymn number 539. Hymn 539, verse 1, 19th century hymn. O Zion, haste, thy mission high fulfilling, to tell to all the world that God is light, that he who made all nations is not willing one soul should fail to know his love and might. Public glad tidings, tidings of peace, tidings of Jesus, redemption, and release. You see why we keep our hymn book? Because it's a repository of great, noble sentiments and theological thoughts. Well, we turn to this very flawed book. We're increasingly unhappy as we go. The very idea of primal revelation in Exodus 3 is totally misleading. And we see he's got a flawed doctrine here and there. And there's also an aspect of his writing that he's trying too hard to convince and overwhelm and pushy. How to describe it. And he's got higher criticism, or should we call it the debased criticism, operating in the background, and he's playing to a constituency there. He's problematic. Anyways, here we are. Beyond Moses, of course, the same divine designation of human agency is evident throughout the Old Testament. It's kind of like a truism. As Moses is called to perform divine intentionality, so the prophets characteristically are summoned to confront worldly power, as was Moses. Alongside prophetic mandate, this mode of divine impingement is evident in the public arena through the summoning and designation of royal power. Most especially is this on exhibit in David, who's identified in the narrative of intimate designation. That is, can you stop banging, please? It's legitimated and given public forum, a more formal prophetic oracle. As Yahweh may summon the worldly power in Israel, so beyond Israel, Yahweh works by human agency. Just get the Westminster Confession of Faith out, Walt. Beyond Nebuchadnezzar, who becomes a cipher for anti-Yahweh power in the Old Testament. Cyrus the Persian, more positively designated by Messiah, whom Yahweh stirs up to accomplish the well-being of Israel. Jeremiah 50, 9 through 10, 2 Chronicles 36, 22 to 23. In Christian reading, moreover, this divine designation of human agency is the taproot of an understanding of Jesus as Messiah, a claim that formally came to be expressed in Trinitarian formulation. The Old Testament and its core articulation of Yahweh's power does not doubt Yahweh's sovereignty. That sovereignty, however, is not for the most part until the belated development of apocalyptic thought and imagery articulated as divine supernaturalism. Thus, Moses is a paradigmatic figure in the New Testament faith who embodies this extraordinary convergence of divine intention and human enactment. What are you going to do with everything before Moses here, old Wally? I'm going to give you a new nickname, Wally. Which is not good. What happened to Genesis? Did it just fly off with the pigeons from the bell tower? It is for this reason, of course, that Moses delays his task so long. What? and resists it as far as he is able. It's an overstatement. For enactment of such a revolutionary and divine purpose is characteristically at odds with established worldly power and characteristically at risk before such power. Invest in big black ink pens because I'm using it so much in these readings that the stock is going to go up. I'm running through pens. That is a terrible statement. The guy's got 2 PhDs too. Just a joke. In sum, this originary or narrative makes clear that Yahweh, for all Yahweh's self-regard, is not a God who exists for God's self. Black ink. He just shoots stuff out of the mouth. There's not the slightest sense of any Westminster faith. The motif of God for the world, God for Israel, God for freedom, God for us, distinguishes this God from those of the surrounding religious environment. Well, no. No. Good grief. We exist for God, not God doesn't exist for us. This guy is flawed from the beginning. This is just ridiculous. I've got a big note at the bottom, flawed doctrine of God. Thus, at the same time, the God who is glorified in holiness is also engaged in and for the historical process. He writes like he's trying to say something new. The narrative form of Israel's faith managed to articulate both these claims at the same time. It is evident that the themes encountered in this dramatic and dialogic self-revelation become the themes that pervade the Old Testament, including Yahweh's narrative art, the prophets, the king's wisdom, and Israel's hymnody in both doxologies and praise and laments of pain. The narrative provides an entry point for all the rich literature that follows in the Old Testament. We turn to chapter 3, a second primal revelation. Well, it was certainly a revelation, but the use of this word primal, what in tarnation is he? Where's that coming from? Primal suggests, primitiveness, something subterranean. It's just a weird term, and if we're sitting in this class in a seminary, we'd be raising our hand. So this is Exodus 19:1 to 24:18. Now, as far as the overview of the book, he's going to talk about 3 primal disclosures: Exodus 3, Exodus 19, and 3 Exodus 32 to 34. Then in part 3, he's going to talk about God as the primal character and agent. 4, the community of praise. 5, the hope of Israel, and the hope of the world. The confrontation of Yahweh with Moses, just considered in Exodus 3-4:17, occurred at Horeb, the mountain of God. The second text we consider, the meeting of Yahweh with Israel, occurred in the wilderness, Sinai, Exodus 19:1. Since Horeb and Sinai are reckoned by scholars to be two names in variant traditions for the same holy mountain, we proceed on the assumption that the 2 meetings with Moses and then with Israel are intimately connected in their testimony about Yahweh's authoritative and generative intervention in the life of Israel. Thus, I shall take Exodus 19 to 24:18 as the second primal revelation of Yahweh as the God of Israel. And so we will just have to do more black ink action. The text, on the one hand, is complex, and scholars have suggested that it consists in the conflation of several strands of tradition. Why, of course, it's really the effort of the scholars to stick their heads into the discussion and talk all the time, instead of letting Moses do the talking. It's scholarly egos. Again, this is dreary stuff. On the other hand, the text has figured prominently in the argument that Israel's covenant is patterned after international treaties, either Hittite or the Assyrian model. For purposes of theological exposition, we may consider in sequence the several rhetorical units that constitute this divine corpus. Distinct corpus, I'm not sure he'd use the word divine. The text begins with a divine word. Well, there he does use it, to Moses in Moses 19, and 19:4-6, an oracle that summarizes much of the faith of Israel. Verse 4 connects the Sinai meeting with the Exodus deliverance, a connection that will be decisive in giving the commands of Exodus 20:1-17. The grounding for the covenant to follow is Yahweh's powerful wonder of the overthrow of the state slave system of Pharaoh. What follows in verses 5 and 6 is a summons to obedience to Yahweh, who has replaced Pharaoh as the master to whom Israel is accountable. The summons includes two quite strong verbs: to listen and to keep the covenant, thus binding Israel into a new and defining relationship. Verse 6 defines Israel's peculiar identity and vocation as a priestly kingdom and holy nation, vis-a-vis other peoples in the whole earth. Thus, the Redeemer of Israel is acknowledged in the same sentence as the creator and sovereign will over all that is. Yahweh has a decisive relationship with all that is outside and beyond Israel. The phrase priestly kingdom is notoriously enigmatic. That may suggest that Israel is of a priestly function vis-a-vis as an intercessor. How about just priests who are intercessors for the people of God? It's going to be defined later in Exodus 25-30 and Exodus 35-40. We're going to see that come in here. I hope we're going to see something on the sacrificial system, or is this all going to be the God of glory without an atonement? We'll see. And if he doesn't have atonement in here, we're going to take this book out to the trash out back to start a fire this fall. This book is not very good. 2 PhDs, and we got to listen to this. The most remarkable thing about this divine summons is that Israel's response in verse 8 is complete and without reservation. Even before Israel hears the commands that are yet to come, Israel is prepared for obedience. Israel's eagerness to sign on with Yahweh likely reflects an awareness that the demands of Yahweh, whatever they will be, are better and lighter demands than the oppressive requirements of Pharaoh, which we saw in Exodus 5. The new allegiance to Yahweh. Moses had this consciousness of the patriarchs before the Exodus. And that leads us to the canon of Genesis. What does Moses know about the Old Testament canon? Well, he obviously knows enough to write about it. So he's got his eyeballs in the books and scrolls. Can we get anything here, Professor? I know I'm being a nuisance in your classroom, but I expect answers out of a man with 2 PhDs, and I'm not getting answers. And it's not going to end very well for you, Professor. That's why I'm here. These are the kind of guys who mislead people when they go to Canada University and seminaries, and then they come out at the other end broken. The three basic themes are announced: linkage to the Exodus, summons to obedience, readiness of response that signifies the establishment of the old covenantal relationship that is now to be narrated in some detail. It's of note here, we're not getting any interaction with the wider body of Old Testament literature, New Testament literature, systematic theology, or church history. We're talking about a guy who is flying blind and who's doing a lot of talking, but his hermeneutic is suspect at best. The most poignant part of the narrative is the theophanic coming of Yahweh to be on the mountain. The characterization of the coming of God expressed in a way that is characteristic in Israel is of a loud, disturbing intrusion that is immensely disruptive. Verses 16 to 25 communicate the danger and threat of divine presence. In dramatic language, this theophanic description parallels Yahweh in the bush, but stretches the description in extreme rhetoric. In verse 25, we do not doubt that Yahweh is fully, sovereignly present in the mountain. As in 3:1-6, the meeting at the mountain is no casual matter. We appreciate that. The mountain is holy because the God who comes there is holy. Entry into such a presence requires preparation and qualification, and that is the second term in the narrative that moves toward chapter 20. Such preparation is reported in 19:10-15, with an admonition to consecrate themselves. While Israel is to make themselves holy, in verse 14, it is Moses who consecrates them. The Israelites wash and so are made clean. Verse 15 reports specifically on the avoidance of sexual conduct, and then the repeated verb touch, naga, suggests that the wrong touching is dangerous and may contaminate or destroy. The rhetoric of the paragraph effects a priestly agenda, otherwise lined out in the tradition of the book of Leviticus, in which approach to the presence of Yahweh must be done with punctilious attentiveness. The interface of careful preparation and disruptive intrusion is strikingly incongruous unless we recognize that priestly interpreters have drawn theophanic rhetoric into the disciplined work of cultic practice. By doing so, the tradition makes clear that the theophany is not a one-time report. It is rather a replicable cultic event where Israel may repeatedly enter into the presence of this dangerous God, but may do so only with great attentiveness. This paragraph concerning preparation thus displaces theophany into a cult. By cult, he means religious practices. He doesn't mean, cult of the Jones or the Mormons. That's another use of the word cult, but here there's a standard and traditional use of the term for religious practices, a little different sense. In doing so, the report adumbrates the careful and detailed traditions of holiness that follow in the development of the Sinai material. The interpretive accomplishment of this juxtaposition of theophany, disciplines of holiness, is to assure that the practice of covenant making is cast as a sacramental activity conducted repeatedly by qualified leadership and participated in by the qualified community. The theophanic report of Exodus 19:16-25. I almost am tempted when this is done to just read Matthew Henry's commentary on the Old Testament. I think there's more food there than this gas bag. I hate to be so blunt, but the theophanic report of Exodus 19:16-25 provides an opening frame for the Decalogue that is now to follow, 21-17. The juxtaposition of theophany and Decalogue, unlike theophany and summons, assumes that the mandate of the Decalogue is original directly from Yahweh, with all Yahweh's authority and without mediation. If we think of Thomas Watson's work, he'd be telling us all the practical and spiritual things that would help us in our current lives. We're not getting any practical theology from this guy. So the guy sitting in this Old Testament class is going to come out at the end kind of dazzled with this guy who's trying to impress the student or the reader. And that's what he's going to try to do in the pulpit, try to dazzle. And the pulpit isn't for that purpose. 2 Timothy 3:16, the pulpit is for its doctrinal instruction, correction, instruction in righteousness, that the man may be perfect, thoroughly furnished for all good works. We're not seeing any of that here. It's like he doesn't even care about the life of the church. The Decalogue is voiced by the sovereign Lord of the covenant. He keeps using these. It's like he's trying to overwork things here. The commands that follow are the rules of emancipation by the Redeemer God, and at the same time, rules for a viable order of life by the Creator. While there are many parallels and analogs in the ancient Near East to other legal materials in the Old Testament, there is no parallel to this utterance from the Holy Mountain. These commands require total and uncompromised obedience, whereas those commands are in the interest of production for the state economy. The Decalogue issues commands that lie outside the state and outside the agenda of the economy. The Decalogue, as is commonly recognized, has 2 points of accent. First, the Decalogue asserts that the distinctive claim of Yahweh to be the sole subject of Israel's worship and obedience, a subject not to be domesticated or contained in any human artistic imagination, not to be harnessed or utilized for any human agenda. That's a good point. Yahweh is here articulated in Yahweh's completely unfettered selfhood, before which Israel must yield in radical and uncompromising obedience. Okay, this God and no other will jealously judge and punish Israel. This God will act in covenant fidelity for all imaginable time to come. Israel's life in this relationship is placed on a wholly new foundation. Second, the God who will be unrivaled in Israel is the God who wills and orders a viable and sustainable human community. The cryptic set of commands sets rigorous limits on exploitative or abuse of the neighbor, guarantees that the neighbor who cannot defend life or liberty or life or property is defended and guaranteed by divine sanction. The neighborly ethic is, of course, decisive of Old Testament faith. We may see it at work in some detail in the particular commands of Deuteronomy 21-24, in which rules are provided for the protection of the vulnerable and economically needy. Beyond the traditions of Deuteronomy, it is fair to say that this neighborly ethic reaches its fullest and most complete articulation in Job 31, in which Job states his innocence with reference to the enacting care of the community. It is not clear about which way the covenantal ethic relates to such a sapiential invention. It It is surely fair to say, nonetheless, that even Israel's wisdom material are shot through with covenantal awareness. It is clear all through wisdom teaching that the members of society are deeply responsible for one another, and that the cohesion of the community is derived from the rule of the Creator-Redeemer God. In Job 31, moreover, it is affirmed, as is characteristic in the Old Testament, that the covenantal ethic is doable. A righteous man or righteous woman can indeed practice such an ethic and is accountable for it. Quote, surely this commandment that I am commanding you today is not too hard for you, nor is it too far away. No, the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart for you to observe. Deuteronomy 30, verses 11 through 14. Well, we'll stop there as far as the reading and try to put this back into larger perspective. That he's given us his introduction to the task in chapter 1. Now he's on the 3 primal disclosures of the bush, Sinai, and then Exodus 32 to 34. 3, God is the primal agent and character. Well, who else would it be in Old Testament theology? God, sovereign metaphor. Israel's confession is of God, the narrative of miracle and order. That should be interesting. 4, the community of praise and obedience. Israel is a community of praise and obedience. Obedience is response in God's dialogic modes. Yahweh is the God of the nations. That's under 4. Number 5 is the hope of Israel and the hope of the world. Land promises, prophetic promises. Hope in every dimension. Hope for the world, hope in alternative modes, and the coming rule of God through fissures to newness. So that's kind of the overview that we have with Walter. And I'm not sure, once we're done with Walter, we're going to have to kind of ponder the next volume on Old Testament theology. We have some candidates in line. Of course, this is all God willing, of course. So we'll finish with a hymn and a prayer, as is the custom. Verse 2 of hymn 539. Proclaim to every people, tongue, and nation that God in whom they live and move is love. Tell how he stooped to save his creation and died on earth that all might live above. Publish glad tidings of peace, tidings of Jesus, redemption, and release. Let us pray. Lord, help us to responsibly engage with Walter and discern what he's really trying to do and say, and help our thoughts that we may, every thought, be brought captive to Jesus. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Well, until next time, God willing, Godspeed.